You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
O'Reilly. You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 178, The Fall of France, Preparations for War. This week, a big thank you goes out to Blade for the donation and to Greg, Daryl, David, Phil, Curtis, JD, and Mark for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. When Britain and France entered the war on September 3rd, 1939, the fact that they were in a conflict with Germany was not necessarily a surprise, and in some ways, they'd been preparing for this conflict since the end of the First World War. Immediately after war was declared, pre-planned actions in London and Paris would begin as both nations began to move onto a war footing. This episode will focus on these actions immediately after the start of the war, when both Britain and France began to mobilize their forces, work out the ways in which both nations would cooperate to defeat their common enemy, and they began to build support for the war among their populations. Unlike during the First World War, these actions would have some real time to be put into place, because there wouldn't be any major fighting for the British and French armies until the fighting in Norway, which would happen in April 1940, and then when the Germans, of course, would invade France in May. This time, often referred to as the Phoney War, was thought by both sides to be to their advantage, which was discussed last episode. One individual I will introduce here in episode 2 of this series, and which will pop up from time to time over the course of the episodes, is a Frenchman, Marc Blanc. Blanc was a First World War veteran, and between the wars would be a relatively well-known historian, and he would still be in the French Reserve in August 1939 when he was once again mobilized due to the threat of a German attack. He would participate in the fighting throughout the course of the French campaign before joining the French resistance in the years that followed. In 1944, he would be executed by the Gestapo for his actions, which meant that he would never live to see his work, Strange Defeat, published in 1946. Strange Defeat would be an early attempt to try and determine why France had done so poorly during the German invasion of May 1940, and it has continued to interest historians for almost 80 years. Blanc's thesis and thoughts would also have an influence on the narrative of the French defeat in the decades that followed the end of the war, with his first-hand account also containing a strong intuition for what had happened and why. But Blanc would write his book after the defeat had already occurred, and perhaps a good place for this episode to start would be the opinions of normal French citizens when the war was first declared, before the German attack would even begin. The experience of normal people in France in September 1939 was somewhat odd. During the First World War, the French armies had marched off to the front, and very soon thereafter news arrived of the Germans attacking into Belgium, and the French army launching their own attacks in Alsace, Lorraine, and in the Ardennes. But the war in 1939 was very different, with mobilization occurring due to the threats made by Germany in late August, and then Poland being invaded, and then the French army being mobilized, and then nothing. The people of France had little insight into the fact that the French government, along with their British allies, were preparing for a long war against Germany, one that would not be won in months, but in years. There would be no talk of troops being home by Christmas, or even launching any real fighting by Christmas by the French and British leaders. While there was some logic in this approach, it did make it difficult to properly maintain public support for the war, because none of the actions that had occurred seemed to manifest an obvious threat to France. Germany was not attacking in the West, and the Allies were not attacking either, so Why was all of this even happening? These feelings were exacerbated by the views of the groups on the radical ends of politics in France, with the radical left leaning into their pacifist anti-war views, while the radical right was concerned that France was going to let the communists win by going to war with Germany. During the Phoney War, the workers, and therefore those on the left in French politics, were an important part of the government planning because the factories were where the long-term war would be won. They had to get that factory output up. This resulted in working hours being quickly increased up to 60 hours in some cases and 72 hours in armament industries, and strikes were outlawed to try and keep labor in line. Pay rates were also frozen, and overtime pay was pinned at normal pay levels, and there was increased taxes on overtime pay. These moves were seen as essential for the future of France and to ensure French industrial output could match and surpass that of Germany. Even in these efforts, there would be mistakes though, particularly around skilled workers, because in some cases, large numbers of skilled workers were mobilized into the army at the start of the war, robbing the factories of their services just when they were needed most. One example of this happening was an artillery shell factory near Bourges in central France, which had so many of its workers mobilized that it was forced to reduce its delivery of shells by 90%. Artillery shells. 90%. Artillery shells are pretty important. This was a well-known problem for industry and had been an important part of the First World War, sort of the retention of skilled workers. And the fact that so many skilled workers were sent to the front in the early weeks of the Second World War is largely inexcusable, especially due to the fact that there were no major French actions planned at this time. Those men would have been much more useful back in their factories. But over all of these mistakes, and the greater work being put in by workers all over France, was the real problem: a lack of enthusiasm. When the troops marched to the front in 1914, there was a cause for celebration. In 1939, it was kind of a cause for mourning. And even though there was general support for the government and for the troops, it was far from the true enthusiasm of the earlier generations. This lack of enthusiasm would become very important when things started to go wrong. The reactions among French soldiers to the mobilization orders was also quite different in 1939, with the general feeling of, I guess let's get it over with, being kind of the feeling of the moment. One of the challenges that were faced by French officers is that their men had been mobilized multiple times over the preceding year, with each of the major European political crises resulting in at least some level of increased readiness for the French army. This would lead one French officer of the 2nd North African Division to say, quote, "The men of the reserve come in without undue haste, without the enthusiasm of 1914, or even that of last year, being fully persuaded that this will, just be a test and they'll be sent home in 2 weeks' time, and annoyed at not being able to complete the harvest," end quote. This feeling was shared by many of the French soldiers, and it did not help that when they arrived at their concentration areas near the border, there was no fighting, and instead many of them were actually sent on harvest collection detail, or simply used as construction troops. One French soldier would write during this period that the complete lack of fighting sapped the morale out of the men, particularly those that had volunteered to fight, writing, quote, "We are forced laborers rather than soldiers. I hardly ever see a rifle, and only have the vaguest notion how our key weapons work and should be maintained," end quote. The general lack of urgency meant that French mobilization would extend over the first 6 weeks of the war, with the movement and then the establishment of long-term positions being quite slow outside of the areas where those positions were already in place, like with the Maginot Line. The French were of course joined by their British allies in their mobilization efforts, which would begin immediately after the start of the war as well. In Britain, there had been many conversations before the war about the size of the army and what the size of the army should be during a war. The two sides of the conversation were generally the political leaders on one side, who wanted a much larger army, and the military leaders on the other side who wanted a smaller army. That may seem a bit odd, but both sides were really pursuing different objectives with their desires for army size. From a political point of view, it was important that as many divisions as possible be sent to France, so that it was clear that the British were doing their part in the alliance. This caused the number 55 to begin to float around the corridors of power in London, with 55 army divisions being seen as a good goal for the army to aim for in its preparations. One of the problems is that to equip such a force over the span of about 2 years would require the British economy to outpace the full war economy that it had seen in 1918, when the British economy was reaching its peak of First World War production, figures that were honestly simply impossible to reach in 1939 and 1940. The British Army, and particularly General Ironside, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, wanted instead a smaller army of maybe around 32 divisions. From a military perspective, the concern was around equipping the larger force and then being able to keep it in the field, with the general feeling being that it was better to have a slightly smaller, better trained and equipped force than a larger force that lacked equipment and training. But in both cases, these were long-term goals, because the expeditionary force that was sent to France was minuscule in comparison. Just a handful of divisions would be sent to the continent. These troops, much like their French compatriots, would spend most of the winter of 1939 and into 1940 working on digging new fortifications. There was also a good amount of training during those months, which was important for the army. But even the small force that was sent was generally ill-equipped in some ways. For example, it did not have enough anti-tank guns to equip all of its units, and so it had to borrow some from the French, even though the French were having troubles equipping their own units with those weapons. One British lieutenant would say of his experience in 1940 that, quote, "As far as equipment was concerned, the harvest of the fruit of 20 years' parsimony would find a scarce and rotten crop. Our only real assets were the sterling qualities of our officers and men who, confronted with a desperate situation, willingly gave their best." End quote. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of British planning and preparations there. More and more British units would arrive in France over the course of the Phoney War, with the number eventually reaching a total of almost 400,000 by the time of the invasion. But around a third of that number, so around 130,000, were not combat troops and were instead support personnel, so the number of combat troops was quite a bit smaller. The good news for the British is that help would arrive from the Commonwealth if the war lasted into the middle or back half of 1940, because Australia and New Zealand would instantly join in the war, with Canada joining not long after. South Africa would also join, although only after there was a change in government. Some other areas under British control, like Egypt, Ireland, and Iraq, would stay out of the war initially, but were soon, in some cases, drawn in anyway. There would be a visit of representatives of many of the dominions in late October 1939 to discuss British strategy, with the report being given to them attempting to justify the lack of British and French actions during the last months of 1939. The report painted a pretty grim picture for the Dominion leaders, claiming that the Germans had the advantage in the air and on the ground in Western Europe, and it was only at sea that the British and French held any real advantage. This had forced upon the Allies a period of inaction, with the hope that it would change in the future as Allied production fully came online and support arrived from the dominions that these leaders represented. One final major source of fighting power would be present in France starting in late 1939, the Polish forces that had been able to escape through Romania. The first unit would be formed before the end of 1939, with 5,000 men forming a Highland Brigade, which was deployed to Norway in April 1940, actually. These efforts would be led by the Polish General Sikorski, who had been able to escape through the Balkans, and he would begin work on the creation of 2 infantry divisions. There are many instances where I do not agree with the criticisms of some leaders during this period in history, but the criticism aimed at the French around these Polish troops is something I fully support. The tens of thousands of Polish troops were ready and willing to fight. Most of them had combat experience in Poland, and all of the officers had been involved in the fighting. The French took almost no advantage of any of them, not just in terms of using their fighting capabilities, but also trying to learn from their experience. This meant that they were mostly neglected, and by the time of the German invasion, they were struggling to equip the units that had been formed. The support was so poor that many of the Polish pilots actually just gave up on France and moved to England, where they would join the RAF, much to the benefit of the RAF in the air battles during the Battle of Britain.
Check engine light on? Take the guesswork out of your check engine light with O'Reilly Veriscan. It's free and provides a report with solutions based on over 650 million vehicle scans verified by ASE-certified master technicians. And if you need help, we can recommend a shop for you. Ask for O'Reilly Veriscan today.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
One of the major lessons learned by French and British leaders during the First World War was that in modern warfare, it was critical for allies to work together as closely as possible. During the first half of the First World War, the two nations had been hesitant to surrender their autonomy to enable truly joint war efforts, which manifested in, for example, the two armies resisting the idea of putting their men under the command of a general of the other army. This completely changed by 1939. And for all the criticisms that can be leveled against the two governments, the one that cannot is that they did not coordinate their efforts as much as possible. We've already discussed one of the ways that this manifested, which was the general support on both sides of the English Channel for a more defensive approach, with both nations supporting the idea of a long war. This was also very clear in the high-level councils and committees that were set up immediately after the start of the war, like the Supreme War Council, which was the highest body of cooperation, involving both Chamberlain and Daladier in their positions as prime ministers. There were then also collaborative groups of military leaders with representatives of both general staffs and many other bodies that were created, and they all immediately got to work coordinating not just high-level strategy, but detailed economic and political and military matters. Joint committees were created for supply, armaments, oil, aviation, and a host of other detailed topics, with the goal of ensuring that the maximum possible value was achieved given the available resources. This also included interactions with other nations, with some coordination of purchases being made primarily in America. At this point, the Americans were very clearly in their neutrality position, which would be formalized in November with the passage of the Neutrality Acts, which allowed all of the belligerents to purchase American goods, but only with cash, and they had to be able to carry the goods on their own ships. This was, strictly speaking, a neutral policy, but it also meant that it clearly favored the Allies, who largely controlled the sea lanes leading to Europe due to the power of the Royal Navy. Even with all of these acts of cooperation, though, all was not perfect within the Western Alliance during 1939, and a key point of contention, especially for the French leaders, was the scope of the British commitment. Nothing could change the fact that the nation most at threat from the Germans was France, and they hoped that the British would show urgency in their preparations, but this was not immediately apparent. There was very quickly financial restrictions put in place for the British economy, including tight controls of the use of foreign currency and the limits on lending by banks to prevent speculation. And for the first time, a wartime budget would be put in place, but it was quite weak from the perspective of the French or what the French wanted. Taxes were only increased from 27.5% to 37.5%, which would raise about £1 billion over the following 6 months, but again, the French wanted more. This, along with the rather small commitment of troops to the continent, would lead the French Minister of Finance and later Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, to tell the American ambassador that the goals of the British policy was to, quote, see French resources exhausted before there was a serious weakening on the part of Great Britain, so that at the end of the war, Great Britain could control the situation absolutely, end quote. Now, this was probably too harsh on the British leaders. There was always some level of concern on the British side that they not commit too many resources to the defense of France, because they wanted to first ensure that they had enough at home to defend against a possible German attack on Britain. Nowhere was the lack of commitment evident, at least to the French, as much as in the commitment of British ground forces. Dating back to the 1920s, the French knew that the British army was not large, and they understood that at least initially the number of British soldiers in France would be small. But the hope was that with the British efforts to motorize and mechanize their forces in the early 1930s, they would be able to contribute a small, highly mechanized force that would be very handy as a highly mobile counterattack force. But then, throughout the 1930s, this hope receded along with British military budgets, and instead it was replaced by a reality in which there were just a few divisions, originally just 2 divisions, moved to France in the first month of the war. This would eventually be increased, but the fact remained that the British Army was completely unprepared to fight a continental war. It was even less prepared than it had been in 1914. Another area of concern for the French, but also cooperation among the two nations, was around aircraft. In this area of preparations for fighting Germany, all of the cooperation and also feelings of an unequal commitment to the war would come into play. The good news is that there was good cooperation around how the two nations interacted with America, which was seen as a key source of aircraft manufacturing capabilities. Both the British and the French would rapidly increase their orders of American aircraft, with the French ordering 2,000 aircraft and 6,000 engines, and the British 1,300 aircraft and 1,200 engines by the start of 1940. There was another massive order placed by the two nations in March 1940 for full delivery by the end of 1941. In these purchases, the two nations had agreed that the British would contribute 60% of the financial resources required to make them, with the purchases being coordinated so that they did not price compete against each other. While this was good coordination, things were far from perfect when it came to air power among the two nations, with the biggest problem being that they were far less prepared than they wanted to be, particularly after the Germans had proven so clearly in Poland the importance of air power. In both nations, the disagreements that had been occurring in the previous decades around how best to use air power continued into the war years, and they debated what kind of aircraft should be built and how many and what their capabilities should be, with the armies wanting close support aircraft, some in the air forces wanting as many bombers as possible, while others wanted to pump out fighters at maximum possible speed. For the British, these conversations also got wrapped up in their specific commitment to France, with there again being many schools of thought on what the best British policy should be. The army wanted as many aircraft as possible on the continent to help defend its forces, which was completely logical, while the Air Ministry was far more concerned with retaining strength in Britain to preserve that strength for a future bombing campaign against Germany, or to defend against a German bombing campaign. The entire situation around air power for the two nations is a great example of their general unpreparedness for war. On the French side, they understood their lack of air power but did not have the domestic production capacity to resolve the problem. On the British side, they could build more aircraft but were never united in how those aircraft should be used. One of the ways that the French government tried to counteract some of these concerns was through a public joint declaration from the two governments that there would be no separate peace signed with Germany by the two nations. This was seen by the French government as a way to bolster the morale of the French public, as it would more closely tie Britain's actions to those of France. The agreement would eventually be made in March 1940, after there had already been several opportunities for both nations to end the war, with Germany sort of proposing some of those opportunities. One of them would occur in October 1939, when Hitler made a speech before the Reichstag in which he suggested that the three nations come together to work out a peace deal. During the speech, he would claim that he had no ill will towards the two nations, and so they should end the war, of course. Hitler's invitation to the negotiating table was loudly and publicly rejected by both Daladier and Chamberlain in the days that followed, with both nations making renewed public commitments to the war. These public commitments, combined with the inaction of the troops in France, did not mean that the two nations were content to just fully wait for the German attack. Instead, throughout the Phoney War, there were many discussions and many plans about trying to get the Germans to fight somewhere else, literally anywhere else. And that will be the topic for the next episode.